When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube, welcome back to the Grease Goblins YouTube channel. Today's video is going to be actually a reaction to Order of the Greenhand, and this is their updated, new and improved Ned and Ashara theory. And for a lot of people, this may come as a surprise on two things. On one, this isn't a Preston Jacobs. We're not continuing our series that I had been doing. Well, why is that? Well, you see, I already had recorded part 4 and 5, and then I realized as I went to edit them, there was no audio. There was audio from me. There was no audio from the video. I don't know why that was. Didn't change any of the settings. It just got corrupted. I guess it didn't record it. So instead of re-recording those videos, it didn't really make sense to me to do those again. It just wouldn't have been as entertaining for me. It wouldn't have come out as good. And I always try to make the best videos for you guys. And if I'm not in it, chances are you guys aren't going to be in it. So we're going to go ahead and go on to the next reaction series, which again, if you guys have not watched Order of the Greenhand or not subscribed to them, I would subscribe to them. They are fantastic YouTubers. They gave me permission to react to their content. So again, thankful for them. And this is a YouTube channel that I actually watched quite a bit. And they're of the more recent YouTube channels that I've watched for Song of Ice and Fire, getting this channel, they are one of them. But this is one of the videos and or their ideas I disagree with. For a lot of you guys on the channel, you know that I'm not a Ned and Ashara guy. I'm very much a traditional Rhaegar Lyanna guy. I stood by that for a long time. So, different than the last series which we did, which was one I really liked, and it's one of my favorite theories, the Maester Conspiracy with Preston Jacobs. We're going to do one of my least favorite theories, and we're going to see what they have to say in this video, what their evidence is. It's going to be a longer series, I'm assuming. I don't think I've watched these in quite a long time. And I think we're probably going to break up this video into a two-part video as well. So again, if you have not subscribed to them, the link will be in the description, and let's get into their video.
Hello, and welcome back to the Wolf's Den. We are the Order of the Greenhand, here to bring some clarity to A Song of Ice and Fire.
Also, they have one of the coolest names. Just want to point that
Today
out
we are
there.
going to get back to our roots and give you the new and improved edition of our N plus A equals J theory.
New and improved, baby.
Our original series on the topic contained the very first videos we ever made, and it has been brought to our attention that we are best known for this theory. And after about a year,
Which I actually agree. I think they're most well known off of this theory. I think out of all the theories I can remember from them, this was the most popular one that I can recall. And it's something that they go deep into with their reread, which is something that is good. I'm glad that they stand behind their ideals.
year of making videos, we have improved a bit with regards to actually making videos.
And again, I sympathize with them a lot. My Maester Conspiracy series, which is something I'm very proud of, it's just very outdated, and I want to get back into it.
And through a combination of constantly researching the text to make weekly videos and the introduction of the annotated iBooks, we have come across new information on the topic that we would like to share with you. This new information will be woven into our original theory and presented in chronological order as a means of further reinforcing the fact
What a
that
picture of Jon.
Snow is Ned Stark and Ashara Dayne's son, and the true heir to Winterfell.
Okay.
So,
And that's basically the premise, that Jon is with Jon's parents are Ned and Ashara, and that would, I guess they're going to argue that that would make him the legitimate heir, and that also he is older than Robb. Also, before we get into this, you guys might note that I skipped ahead a couple seconds. They played some music that was A, very loud, and 2, I don't know if it was playable on YouTube, so I'm not going to take any chances. So yeah.
Before we get this party started, we wanted to first clarify for everybody who's watching this video that we are not talking about the once greatest show that ever was or will be. We are talking about the book.
So, the reason they're going to bring this up right away is because you'll have arguments like mine that will include arguments from the show. And what they want to do here is say that we're going with just the book. Now, my argument has always been you can't just go with the book. There's other context outside of the book that's very important to talk about. So I will bring that up when I think it is relevant, but that is their argument. They're just sticking to the books.
And no, The books and the show are not the same thing anymore.
Agreed, they're not.
Please do not flood our comment section with comments about what the show is doing, because the two have almost nothing to do with each other at this point. George R. R. Martin.
I want to point out this right now. Because one, Game of Thrones and George R. R. Martin, especially the early seasons, he was very connected within them. So when people do bring up things talking about the series, you can't just write it off. Now, again, later things that happen later in the seasons, yeah, it's not going to happen the same in George R. R. Martin's world. They're just two different things. But we have to look at where those things came from. And that's something I will talk about when I feel like it's relevant to talk about. But people having the argument that say, well, D&D got interviewed and got the job based on the idea of did they know who Jon's parents was, is very relevant information and is decent citable evidence to support the claim of R plus L. So where I'm disagreeing on that point that you can't bring up the show, I get why they are using that to defend their theory.
Martin called the show licensed fan fiction, and David Benioff said the show is so different than the books that book readers will be shocked. So please, do not waste your time or ours lecturing us about what the show is doing.
So let's get straight to it.
Again, just because they're putting a heavy emphasis on this, I'm just going to say right away, Ashara is not in the show, and George R. R. Martin helped write the first season. Ashara, out of her 5 times that she's named in the books, is named most prevalently in the first book. Just think that is evidence that should be pointed out there, but I get, again, why they're not going that route.
R plus L equals J is a flimsy book theory at best. It basically combines Promise Me Ned from A Bed of Blood and Ned's an honorable guy, and is usually accompanied by 2 or 3 quotes from the books that could be used to support it if you ignore the context of where it came from, and then concludes that obviously Rhaegar plus Lyanna equals Jon. George R. R. Martin's a song.
So, the way I would counter that is we not only see multiple occurrences where it would make more logical sense that Rhaegar and Lyanna is the true parents of Jon more than Ned and Ashara. When we think about Ned and how he thinks about his sister Lyanna, there's a quote that we look at when we look at Arya, right? I just got done doing this chapter where basically Ned says that everyone lies at some point, and some lies are honorable. And this is directly right in the chapter where he's thinking about Lyanna. So what would he be lying about that revolves around Lyanna? That would have major significance. And I want you to remember that in all of these Ned chapters, Ashara is not someone that Ned is thinking about, right? Ashara is not someone that's ever really in Ned's head at all. So, to make the argument that, again, I think poor choices of words by them, saying that R plus L is a very flimsy theory when you can kind of turn that on a Ned and Ashara as well. And so the point they're making about Ned being honorable, well, exactly, that's the exact point, right? Ned is propped as this person that is very honorable. He doesn't do, he's not going to cheat on Catelyn. And there also comes the issue of why wouldn't Ned tell Catelyn that Jon is Ashara's? It just doesn't really add up to me, but let's continue.
Song of Ice and Fire is far too complex for that. In fact, when his wife was asked about R plus L equals J at a party in 2002, she actually laughed in the person's face and said that is too simple for George. That's
a quote a lot of people bring up. And the way I would counter that is, yes, you're right, A Song of Ice and Fire is not so simple. Then how come when we view the characters, right? What is the theory that's told to us by the people in the world? That Jon's mother is Ashara. There's never even a single person that ever mentions that it was Rhaegar and Lyanna that was Jon's parents. That's never, nobody ever says that. So the idea that's saying that Rhaegar and Lyanna is too simple, but then turning around and saying Ned and Ashara isn't is very contradictory, in my opinion. But yeah.
These books are painstakingly detailed, to the point where even if you were to read them a dozen times, you'd probably still miss the significance of 2/3 of the information
Exactly.
provided.
I miss information all the time. So yeah, I definitely agree with that point.
As
And
figuring
another thing I want to say, because maybe I'm coming off kind of aggressive in this video, is that I might be right, they might not be right. You know, we don't know this information. I'm going off of what I believe, and they're going to go off what they believe, which is fine.
requires that you connect dots that are often thousands of pages apart.
Now, the reason I think this theory really took off is twofold. First of all, for a decade and a half, there was no plausible alternatives to Jon as to who could be Rhaegar and Lyanna's child. And as such, it became thought of as virtually bulletproof. But then, A Dance with Dragons came out, and we meet a character that fits the bill much better than Jon does. Those of us who read the books post-2011 got to read all 5 of them in quick succession, and most likely have a slightly different view of the story than those of you who started reading the books in 1996.
That's a fair point.
There was no waiting involved when we went through them, which obviously makes it easier to remember little details throughout the story. On top of that, we had resources available to us that weren't around when the books first came out, such as the app in the world of...
So, I agree with what they're saying here, that, like, the way someone who started the books at the beginning interprets it, the way someone else that, like, reads them in rapid succession are going to be vastly different. But the way I look at the way the story is, that we're saying, oh, that Rhaegar and Lyanna was the main leading theory for years. It just leads me to believe that Ned and Ashara got propped up to be different because
of Ice and Fire.
We'd had Rhaegar and Lyanna for so long.
We think this theory became as popular as it is. People didn't have the resources available to them to understand the timeline surrounding Jon Snow's birth. With the release of The World of Ice and Fire, the app, annotated iBooks, and all of the additional information that's provided in them, calculating when key events took place during this time period is now possible.
I'm going to say this right away. I don't read into the timeline as much as other people do because George R. R. Martin is not good with timelines. He's not good at, like, putting dates together. And that's just been very prevalent with the way Robert's Rebellion had been viewed up to that point.
Where it wasn't previously. Which
Exactly.
allowed for a lot of false information to circulate for so long that millions of people now think they're facts. This made it possible for people to incorrectly determine that there wasn't enough time for Ned and Ashara to develop a serious relationship. Because
to that, I definitely agree with what they're going with. I think Ned and Ashara could have had some crush. They could have gotten closer. And I do think, like, Ned, regardless of how far I think Ned did have feelings for Ashara. I just think with the context given around the relationship, I think it's much more likely that it was actually Brandon and Ashara that would have had a thing, not Ned.
Because after Harrenhal, they think that Robert's Rebellion just almost immediately broke out.
Yeah, no, it doesn't.
And in such a time of madness, when would Ned have had time to be falling in love with Ashara? After all, he was busy fighting and winning a war. However, once you figure out the timeline, you realize that there's a heck of a lot more time that passes between these events than most people think.
Additionally, understanding the timeline of events during this time period makes it abundantly clear that no child conceived at Harrenhal could have been born during Robert's Rebellion. So, we're now going to quickly identify 3 key events and when they took place.
Okay.
Which we think
Let's
will
get
paint
into
a
it.
very vivid picture of the sequence of events in the few years leading up to Jon Snow's birth. The first is the tourney at Harrenhal. In The World of Ice and Fire, The Fall of the Dragons, it says that the tourney took place in the year of the false spring. It also tells you that the false spring lasted about 2 months, and that it started snowing again in King's Landing on the last day of the year 281. That essentially means that, using our calendar, the false spring took place in November and December of the year 281.
Okay.
And since we know the tourney took place during the false spring, the tourney was held sometime during the last 2 months of 281.
The next identifiable plot point is Brandon Stark and Littlefinger's duel for Catelyn. According to both Catelyn and the app, Littlefinger was 15 years old when he dueled Brandon, and Catelyn notes that he was still shy of 30 when she first sees him in King's Landing in A Game of Thrones, which is pretty well established to have taken place in the year 298. So, if he's still 29 years old when Catelyn sees him in 298, and he was 15 years old when they fought the duel, that leaves only the years 283 and 284 as possible years that the duel took place.
Okay, this makes sense.
Now, there are a multitude of reasons why the year 284 needs to be eliminated, and I don't really think that we need to waste our time going over it here. So that only leaves one viable option as to when the duel took place. 283, most likely pretty early in the year.
Okay, I have no problems with that.
Why is this important to note? Well, Brandon Stark was obviously still alive when he dueled Littlefinger, and their duel took place prior to the start of Robert's Rebellion, which means over a year went by between the tourney at Harrenhal and the start of Robert's Rebellion, which really does make sense, because the tourney happened during the fall spring, and then winter came back for an unknown period of time before the actual spring came.
Okay.
When the actual spring came,
Sorry guys, I'm not saying much at this portion of the video. There just isn't much to really say. What they're trying to establish right now is the groundwork for when Jon could have been born, when Robb could have been born, and when a lot of these characters could have been born. So that's kind of what they're setting up here. There isn't really much for me to really talk about until they start getting to their conclusions from this information.
when the marriage was announced, that prompted Littlefinger to get so drunk that he ended up sleeping with Lysa, and still to this day believes that it was Catelyn.
Yes.
And then he got it in his head
Just
that he
a
should
illusion
challenge
of that.
Brandon Stark for her hand. However, Brandon didn't immediately ride to Riverrun to fight him, as Ned explains to Littlefinger in his very first small council meeting that Brandon had spoken about Littlefinger, quote, often and with some heat.
Yes, he wasn't a big fan.
This would indicate that some time had passed between Littlefinger's challenge and Brandon's trip south, because in order for him to speak about it often, it would require that he brings it up several times.
Yep, I agree. I agree with that.
Brandon likely wasn't in the mood to make a special trip to Riverrun to deal with the likes of Littlefinger, as it would require him to travel, about a month or so in each direction, so he probably decided that he would just arrive at Riverrun earlier than the rest of the Starks, so he could take care of his duel prior to the wedding guests arriving.
Which, again, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. Like, do you really want this dude who's obviously in love with your wife skulking about when your family comes down, possibly creating issues? I think that's a very logical conclusion.
The next identifiable plot point is Viserys fleeing King's Landing in the wake of Rhaegar's defeat at the Trident. In A Game of Thrones, Daenerys won. Dany tells us that Viserys was 8 years old when he and his newly pregnant mother fled King's Landing and went to Dragonstone. The World of Ice and Fire tells us that Viserys was born in the year 276. Well, a child born in the year 276 cannot turn 8 until the year 284. So,
Okay.
using that timeline, you can sort of establish approximately when the events that kind of drive the mystery behind Jon Snow's birth took place. Now that we've established that, it is time to present what we know took place between these key events, then draw on this information to try to fill in the gaps.
Okay.
So, let's start.
Again, I don't have really much to say about a lot of this information. I mean, this is just basically looking at events that we know happened, putting them into the gaps, and trying to figure out a set timeline to where they can make their conclusions, and then
with
I
what we
can
know about
whether
Harrenhal.
agree, disagree, or give criticisms
According
to
to
those.
the Night of the Laughing Tree story told by Mira, Ned and Ashara met and danced at Harrenhal.
Yes.
This is backed up by Ned Dane telling Arya that Ashara and Ned met and fell in love at Harrenhal. We also know that Rhaegar won the joust, and for some reason decided to walk right past his third trimester pregnant wife and crown Lyanna the Queen of Love and Beauty, which, as you might imagine, didn't particularly sit.
But let's also think about that, right? Think about how many characters also think that Ashara is extremely beautiful. She has these purple eyes that make her stand out. And not only did Rhaegar go past her, but also went past Elia. So it makes you really realize that there had to have been some reason Rhaegar goes to Lyanna outside of just Lyanna was beautiful, because I just don't see it as, oh, he picks out a beautiful. Why wouldn't he just go to Ashara then? I don't know. I think that definitely supports that
Well,
probably
with several
Lyanna had
notable
met
characters.
Rhaegar.
So, it would appear that 2 romances involving Starks began at Harrenhal. Where did everyone go after the tourney? Well, it is never explicitly stated that Rhaegar and Elia immediately returned to Dragon.
So we kind of skipped something that I think is important to note. I think it was in a quote when we were looking at this, but it says, "The Kragan man saw a maid with laughing purple eyes dance with a white sword, a red snake, and the Lord of Griffins, and lastly with the quiet wolf, but only after the wild wolf spoke to her on behalf of a brother too shy to leave his bench." So what does this kind of imply? It kind of implies, in my opinion, that Brandon Stark has a way with words, with women. And we know from Lady Dustin that Brandon Stark was kind of like Robert in a way, where he took what he wanted. And when we're talking about a theory that has, a man basically going out of wedlock and having sexual relations with someone else, does that make more sense for Brandon or Ned? And the other idea here is that Ned seems to be kind of the shy brother who, he doesn't really go up to Ashara. It just makes me feel like Brandon and Ashara had some knowledge of each other before then. So I don't know. I think this is some evidence that maybe we'll go back to in this theory, but I think it was something that, was brushed over a little bit.
Involving Starks began at Harrenhal. Where did everyone go after the tourney? Well,
and this is very important to understanding a lot of theories. For the Littlefinger started Robert's Rebellion theory, this is also very important.
It is never explicitly stated that Rhaegar and Elia immediately returned to Dragonstone following the tourney.
And I think if you look at them just logically, think about it like this, right? You're Elia, you're pregnant, and you might struggle with childbirth. It's always a scary time for a woman, especially in this world when they don't have the proper health care. Your husband now has just crowned some other younger woman as Queen of Love and Beauty. I can imagine that would be a very awkward trip that both of them may not go together.
But it seems almost impossible that they didn't, because Elia gave birth to their son Aegon on Dragonstone before the new year, and the fall-spring was the last 2 months of that year. Birthing Aegon nearly killed her, and shortly thereafter, the Maester on Hand informed Rhaegar that Elia would be unable to bear him any more children.
Which is devastating for Rhaegar, who we know liked his prophecy. Rhaegar was someone that wanted the 3 heads of the dragon, and if his wife can't give him another son or daughter, which I think he probably wanted a daughter, just looking at Aegon and his sisters, Visenya and Rhaenys, probably wanted another daughter, but that was not going to be able to happen with Elia, so
right
he has
to
go out of his wedding.
Rhaegar and his companions
marriage
left Dragonstone, and no one seems to know where they went. Only that he showed up in King's Landing to lead the Targaryen forces north to the Trident at the end of Robert's Rebellion. Elia, on the other hand, stayed on Dragonstone to recover until she was summoned to King's Landing by Aerys after the rebellion started,
which again was a threat, basically to the Dornish, saying support us, or maybe Elia doesn't have such a good time. But another thing to consider when Rhaegar leaves Dragonstone, and we don't really know where he went, think about it like this. Lyanna, we know for a fact, did not go back north. And she'd already been crowned by Rhaegar. Rhaegar is now, to fulfill his prophecy, looking for someone to mate with, to have another child with. It makes logical sense that Rhaegar would have ran into Lyanna. The two probably could have been communicating. At this time, Harrenhal was being overlooked by a Went, and there was a Went in the Kingsguard that was very friendly with Rhaegar. All of the seeds are there for how that relationship could have come about.
as an insurance policy of sorts, because he feared the Dornish would turn on them and he wanted Elia and her children as hostages to ensure that they didn't.
Which I don't even think is a bad plan
During
from
this
Eris.
prolonged stay on Dragonstone, following Harrenhal and the birth of her son, it is almost certain that Elia's lady companions, such as Ashara Dane, would have been with her.
I agree. I
In
think
fact,
that's fair.
George R. R. Martin's own words further support the claim that Ashara spent at least some time at Dragonstone with Elia following the tourney.
In response to a fan letter, George R. R. Martin indicated that Ashara was a lady companion to Elia during the first few years of her marriage to Rhaegar. We know Rhaegar and Elia were wed in 280. Therefore, in order for Ashara to serve for a, quote, few years, then...
I think this makes perfect sense that Ashara Dane would be with Elia. I think that just makes logical sense. The two were good friends. I think one of the leading reasons as to why I think Ashara is dead is you look at all of the people that were her closest friends, they tend to end up dying very brutally. And if you even put that together with that she may have had some relation with Brandon Stark, maybe this child that she has, she has a miscarriage or whatever, and that's kind of the final push, as well as Brandon being dead. I think, this is just evidence to why I think she probably did end up killing herself. But yeah, I definitely agree with the point that they're making here, that Elia probably was with Ashara at some point.
We know she had to have
During
continued
Dragonstone.
serving Elia for at least some time following the tourney, which took place in 281. Given the European-inspired feudal customs and traditions within the story, it is likely that if Ashara were to leave her role as a lady companion to the princess, there would have to be a reason. As a general rule, it seems like there would be 3 ways to be released from such a role. The first would be courtship and marriage. The second would be some sort of complicated resignation that would likely require a good reason and both the royal family and her family's consent. And the third is getting dismissed. Both the second and third options seem very unlikely.
Here's what I'd add to this, right? Or Elia and Ashara were good friends. And when you look at the growing tension that's going on and Elia being summoned back to King's Landing, I think it's very simple that Elia could have gone, Ashara, I don't think you should come here. I'm being basically held here as a captive, more or less, an insurance policy like they stated before. I think those are all logical reasons as to why she could have gotten out of that. Also, let's also think about something else. If Ashara was possibly pregnant at this point, whether that be with, say, like a child from Brandon, I, again, highly doubt a child from Ned, because I feel like at this point, Ned was not going to do that unless they were married. There's a lot going on there, because then the other issue is if Ned was married to Ashara and then slept with her at this point, well, why then would he lie to Catelyn that it goes against all of Ned's ethics, in my opinion, from what we've seen from the character. And I think it just makes more logical sense, and it's much easier to fit into the story if we're going with this top option, is that it's because of Brandon, and that she could then hide the pregnancy, not being at court, surrounded by, again, Varys, all of these spies constantly being able to tell what's going on.
As either would have been accompanied by gossip and or juicy rumors, and there are none. According to Ned Dane, Ned and Ashara met and fell in love at Harrenhal. Following the tourney, it seems almost certain Ashara returned to Dragonstone with Elia.
I would agree. I think that makes sense.
We also know that Ned spent a considerable amount of time in the Vale, even after his fostering. Gulltown and Dragonstone are pretty close, and these two are young and in love. Ned is a second son, and is therefore relatively free to pursue.
So again, but we had a quick jump there. This is my issue when we talk about, say, Ashara and Ned being quote-unquote in love. There wasn't really anything that suggested that. The two danced. We know that's true. Ned didn't Ashara didn't come up to Ned saying, let's dance. It was Brandon who stepped in and was the one to do that. So there's no idea, and that's some of the problems I have, is that, if we're going to call a theory like Rhaegar and Lyanna's flimsy, but then in their argument, they say here that Ned and Ashara are already in love at this point, and they're young and in love. We know that Ned probably had some feelings of Ashara, but again, did Ashara reciprocate that, or was it kind of like a pity thing, or was Brandon asking her to dance with him. We don't know if that was really ever reciprocated. And when we talk about like Ned returning Dawn, it could have been Ned's love of her. We don't know if that was reciprocated, and there's not really a lot of evidence to support that coming from Ashara specifically, and there really hasn't been any that has been brought up in this video. And that's when I look at the idea that Rhaegar and Lyanna had feelings for each other. They are much more apparent, and there's more evidence to support that than Ned and Ashara having those feelings.
A love match, should his father approve of his choice. And the only thing standing between Ashara and seeing Ned would be Elia, who by all accounts was a nice girl, who would probably have been happy for her friend. So, in going on Ned Dane's claim that Ned and Ashara fell in love at Harrenhal, plus the fact that there was...
Again, the idea here is that a young kid knows this, which could be gossip, it could be this or that. I mean, I don't know, I don't take a lot of stake on that.
In the way of them seeing one another, there is virtually no way that they never saw each other again after the tourney. We also know that Ashara wasn't with Elia when King's Landing was sacked, which means she left her position prior to Elia going to King's...
Which again makes sense. I mean, I think the most logical point of where Elia and Ashara's like whole relationship ended was that time when Elia goes to King's Landing, because Elia is not dumb. She's not a dumb person. She understands the danger that's going to happen when she is basically forced to go to King's Landing with Eris. I don't think she would want, a good friend, like we just talked about how Elia is a nice person, to then have Ashara with her. I think that makes a lot of sense. But the question then kind of comes to, again, is there any evidence to support that Ashara was going to see Ned during this time? And again, I don't know if you can make that argument. I mean, you can make the same argument that at this point, Brandon Stark was around the Riverlands that we're talking about. It's just as likely that Brandon could have been seeing her. Like, again, and that's the point I'm trying to make, right, is that there's so much uncertainty with this theory so far that they've presented that I can make the same argument for Brandon instead of Ned, where Brandon was also in the same kind of area, and Brandon is much more lusty than Ned. So when you fit the character arcs and where we see them later in the story, it makes more sense that actually Brandon had a relationship with her and not Ned. And Ned maybe didn't know that. And Ned, I think, harbors that love for her, but it's the idea that we don't know if Ashara reciprocated that.
Landing.
Alright, this might seem like an abrupt ending, but this recording session for this video actually was over an hour long, so I decided for it to be more digestible for you guys, I decided to split it into a second part. The second part is already being recorded, so again, you guys will see that in next Saturday's video, but I wanted to make, 2 parts for this first part of the video. So again, I hope you guys enjoyed the first part. I want to preference by saying at the very end of this part that I didn't, mean if I went in just looking back on the recording to go maybe as in on their takes as I did. And I want to preference that there's no hate towards them or their thoughts. I am just very passionate about my theory and my stance on the subject. So I'm going to try and defend it as best as I can. And again, I think it's great that other people have different opinions because nobody knows who's right yet. So yeah, thank you guys all for watching the video, and I'll see you guys all in the next video. Bye, guys.